Good morning from California, and good afternoon and good evening to the rest of you. I'm Stas Margaronis, president of the Propeller Club of Northern California, and this is the Inland and Great Lakes Shipping Panel. And I am introducing Aimee Andrus, executive director of the Inland Rivers, Ports, and Terminals. Aimee is the executive director, and she is also the author of the Coastal and Inland Ports and Terminals and Commerce Act, which I hope she will discuss. Aimee is also a member of the board of directors of the International Association of Marine Port Executives. More importantly, from our discussion yesterday about congestion, inland ports are taking an increasingly more important role as a means of maritime and container transportation. And we will be hearing more about that from our panelists. Aimee, thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to the International Propeller Club Convention.
Well, thank you so much, Stas. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for having us. I'm excited for this panel today. I'm excited to bring some alternative supply chain solutions to the group that include the inland waterways, the inland river transportation system, and the Great Lakes. I just want to very briefly tell you about Inland Rivers, Ports, and Terminals. Our association is a national association for port and terminal professionals. We provide some resources in order for them to increase their business so that we can offer solutions. Most of our inland port and terminals are very small in staff size, and so they do rely on their associations at time for whether it be education resources, legislation. We offer different initiatives, including container on barge initiatives. Container on barge, it's not a new concept. What we are seeing on the river system is that it's becoming more popular as an alternative to your current congestion issues that you might have on the West Coast. If we were to have our ocean carriers call on the Gulf Coast or even the Great Lakes, we can then transload those containers and ship those down the river system into the heartland of the country, where those containers can then disperse throughout that supply chain network. I find it most interesting with the congestion that is happening on the West Coast, and we kind of saw a little bit of this back in 2014 when they had the labor strike going on the West Coast. At the same time, it seemed there was some rate increases and rate hikes on the East Coast. And at that time too, the conversation kind of shifted into shippers wanting an alternative to their supply chain. So at that time, container on barge did come to the forefront of the conversation. I'm super proud of the IRPT members that have explored offering container on barge into their current portfolios. I will say that Memphis, Baton Rouge, New Orleans, and I believe maybe even St. Louis, hopefully one of our panelists will speak on that today, have offered container on barge as a solution to that congestion that we saw in 2014. So like I said, we currently do have container on barge shipping on the Mississippi River. And so we are very proud of our partners and our members that have entered into that type of supply chain. We offer solutions and resources to our members who are, wanting to get into container on barge, as far as finding suppliers and service providers that may, offer, whether it's the attachments, the handling equipment, maybe it's security, as far as, securing those containers, offloading and waiting on port property, etc. So that's a little bit about our association. As far as the river system and what we are seeing, yes, the IRPT did write a bill back in 2019. We did get it passed in 2020. What the bill did, it was essentially set aside special federal funding through the Port Infrastructure Development Program, the PIDP, out of the Department of Transportation, specifically for smaller ports and inland ports and terminals. What we were seeing is a lot of our members who wanted to get into container on barge or even other types of shipping, they just needed small amounts of capital investments, not these major like $20 million kind of grants. And the opportunities for funding that were out there were for these major and massive projects. So those members of IRPT and smaller ports that aren't members, we're having a hard time, applying for those grant funds and competing against the larger ports, the LA Long Beach and New York, New Jersey. And so by getting the bill passed, we were able to set aside $41 million through the Department of Transportation, where these ports can apply for that special set aside funding. It's unclear just yet how much has been applied for. We are expecting an over application amount or rate, given that it's the first year. And I think that will show us, and it will give us an indication into the future what our infrastructure funding needs might be on a smaller scale, including the inland river system. And again, we're not talking about the 20, 25 million or $50 million capital investments. And speaking of capital investments, I also want to just express my gratitude and my pride for our members. After 2019, what we saw were devastating floods on 3 major river systems at the same time. I know my heart broke for a lot of our members whose facilities were just inundated with those floodwaters. That was a historic year for us. It was a historic year for the Army Corps of Engineers, who, of course, wanted to get back in there to operate and maintain our river system. But the great news is that we did overcome. We have recovered. Our river system is open for business, and we're operating currently at under capacity. So what that means is we can handle that additional cargo that may be coming to the river system as an alternative supply chain solution to our Walmarts, our Costco's, etc. So I hope all of that makes sense. I am happy to answer any questions that you may have, after our panelists, give a great presentation. And so speaking of our panelists, I just want to say, Steve Fisher, Mark Wright, and Bill Stallman. This is a really great group of fine gentlemen. When we talk about, expertise on the marine transportation system that includes the river system and the Great Lakes, Steve, Mark, and Bill are the guys that you want to talk to. Not only are they engaged in everyday business and opportunities with their members and who they represent, but they're right there on the ground, kind of boots on the ground. So with that, I do want to introduce Steve Fisher to you. And I'll kind of go through who our panelists are today, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Fisher. But Steve Fisher is the executive director of the American Great Lakes Ports Association, and he's been that executive director since '94. He currently serves on a number of marine industry organizations, including the Great Lakes Commission, the Great Lakes Pilotage Federal Advisory Committee, and the Great Lakes Seaway Partnership. He has served on the Washington staff previous to this role. So he has worked on transportation and appropriations legislation. We also have Mark Wright. He currently serves as the Southern Region Vice President of the American Waterways Operators, the AWO. AWO is a national trade association as well, primarily for the towboat, the tugboat, and the barge industry associations. He currently oversees the relations with the Coast Guard's 8th District and sectors in Mobile, New Orleans, Houston, and Corpus Christi. So we're going to hear a little bit more about that capital investment, the operation maintenance from Mark. And then Mr. Bill Stallman, a great friend of mine, he is currently the construction, and such a great friend that I was like, I don't need his bio. Director of Engineering and Construction for America's Central Port. Bill currently serves as the chair for the Illinois Ports Association. He currently serves on the board of directors for Inland Rivers Ports and Terminals. He serves on numerous committees, including the Ports and Harbors Committee for COPRI, and he serves on the Committee for America's Infrastructure with the ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers. Bill's been awarded numerous awards through ASCE and has been awarded St. Louis's 40 Under 40 in 2017. So with that, Mr. Fisher, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself and giving us an overview of the American Great Lakes Ports Association.
Great, thanks, Amy. Can I first confirm that you can hear me okay?
Yes, sir, we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Amy, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Propeller Club for inviting me to participate in this panel today. It's a great honor. I've watched the conference over the last few days and really been impressed with the speakers and the quality of the discussion, and have learned a lot, quite frankly, in the last 2 days. I'd like to take some time today to tell you a little bit about our organization, tell you a little bit about Great Lakes Shipping, and then share with you some of the issues we're working on. Our organization is a public policy advocacy organization, so I'll probably be talking more about public policy challenges that we're confronting, less so commercial challenges, because I'm not a commercial guy. I'm essentially a lobbyist. But our organization was founded in the late 1970s to represent the interests of the public port authorities on the US side of the Great Lakes. We're one of several regional port organizations throughout the United States, and we almost exclusively focus on the unique aspects of Great Lakes shipping that are uncommon to other areas of the United States. Our membership includes 15 public port authorities. Our membership requires our members have to be public agencies, so we are a trade association of local public agencies. And I invite all of you to visit our website to learn more about us and our activities at greatlakеsports.org. Just assuming some of you on the line don't necessarily know about Great Lakes shipping, I would like to take a few minutes to talk about the Great Lakes navigation system. If you could switch to the next slide, that'd be great. The first thing to point out, which makes it particularly challenging in the Great Lakes, is that Canada owns half the Great Lakes. So we are not exclusively a US waterway. We have to work closely with our Canadian partners. Canadian government regulations impact our commerce as much as US government regulations do. And we work closely with Canadian maritime trade associations to try to partner with them, to have them work public policy in Ottawa as we work on public policy in Washington. The Great Lakes navigation system handles about 140 million tons of cargo every year. It is a deep draft navigation system. It's primarily a bulk system, a little bit of break bulk, and almost no containerization, a little bit, but not much. 3 vessel operator communities serve the region. We have a decent sized fleet of American vessels operating under the Jones Act. We have a fleet of Canadian flag vessels operating under the Canadian version of the Jones Act, the Coasting Trade Act. And then we have international vessels, ocean-going vessels coming into the Great Lakes through the St. Lawrence Seaway from literally anywhere in the world. Again, generally smaller vessels because the locks on the navigation locks on the St. Lawrence Seaway limit the size of those vessels. The navigation system supports a number of industries in the Midwest, primarily steelmaking, which is critical to the nation's economy, raw materials for steelmaking, and all those various commodities like iron ore, limestone, coal, coke, and so on. Also the energy industry, we still move a good amount of coal on the Great Lakes to power plants around the region. The agricultural sector is a major shipper on the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence Seaway system. And then the construction industry, we move lots of stone and limestone for construction. The system is, a primary attribute of the system is a series of navigation locks, very similar to the inland waterway system. On the Great Lakes, to go from the Atlantic Ocean all the way west to Duluth, Minnesota, which is the farthest west you can go in the Great Lakes, a vessel passes through 16 navigation locks. Of those locks, excuse me, of those locks, 13 are in Canada. So those locks are the responsibility of the Canadian government, but 3 are in the United States. To make things even more complicated, of the 3, we have 2 different federal agencies that own and operate them. In northern Michigan, we have locks operated by the Army Corps of Engineers. And then there are 2 locks in upstate New York on the St. Lawrence River, which are operated by the U.S. Department of Transportation. And of course, part of our role is to keep in touch with Congress and those federal agencies to make sure those locks are invested in and maintained. Can we go to the next slide? I want to hit some of the issues we're working on. This slide just gives you an idea of some of the many things we're working on right now. I don't want to talk about all of them, nor do we have time to, but I would like to just hit a few to give you a sense of the variety of challenges we're working with. Next slide, please. Like any port anywhere in the United States, we have a close relationship with the Army Corps of Engineers, who's responsible for maintenance of our harbors. We in the Great Lakes are on the same funding system as coastal ports. As you all know, the Inland River system has a different funding system with the Corps, but we are on the same system referred to as coastal deep draft navigation, which is the same as the coastal ports. Our funding comes from the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, and commerce on the Great Lakes is assessed the harbor maintenance tax as it is on the coasts. And consequently, we work with the Corps and we work with Congress to make sure there are adequate funds coming out of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. Just to give you a sense, I think many of you know that for years, Congress was constraining spending from the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, and that was leading to inadequate maintenance of the nation's harbors. And over the years, we developed quite a backlog in the Great Lakes of work that needs to be done in our harbors and funded in the Corps' operation and maintenance budget. We have almost $1 billion backlog right now in the Great Lakes of work that needs to be done. $375 million of dredging in various Great Lakes harbors around the region. $320 million of breakwater repairs. These are stone structures that are out in the water to protect our waterfronts and port entrances. And then the locks I mentioned that the Corps operates in northern Michigan require almost $225 million of maintenance over the next 5 years to keep them operating. Next slide, please. The source of all this money, as I said, is the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, and Congress had been restraining funding from that trust fund. We have worked cooperatively with our sister ports from around the country and AAPA to try to convince Congress to increase appropriations from the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund for Corps of Engineers operation and maintenance activity. And you can see since fiscal year 2013, working together, the ports in this country have convinced Congress to double spending from the trust fund. And that has done a lot to open up the funds to take care of our navigation needs and our dredging needs and so on throughout the country. Our philosophy in the Great Lakes is that working in partnership with our sister ports around the country, if we can grow the pie for the whole country, the slice of the pie that goes into the Great Lakes will grow as well. And you can see that in the second column from the right. The amount of money coming into the Great Lakes has grown considerably as the national pie has grown. So it's been a successful strategy, and we look forward to continuing to work with ports all around the country to keep the pressure on Congress and keep the cooperation going so that we can see more and more resources coming out of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund to maintain our ports and in the Great Lakes to catch up on this backlog. Next slide, please. As I said, in northern Michigan, the Corps of Engineers operates a set of locks. We've referred to them as the Sioux locks. They're located in a town called Sault Ste. Marie, which is a French name from colonial times. But the locks have existed there for over 100 years. The most recent iteration of these locks, the newest lock, is from the late 1960s. There's a project right now to construct a new lock, and if you look at the photograph, the two lock chambers you see on the right are currently retired. The two on the left are active. The current project is to rip out the two on the right and replace them with a brand new single lock chamber. So at the end of the day, we'll have 3 locks there and some redundancy. The lock that you see the vessel in right now in the photo That lock is much bigger than the adjacent lock, and we'd like to have a redundant separate second large lock in that location. The project is a $1.4 billion project. It is currently under construction, so we've been working closely with Congress to keep construction funds flowing. I'm pleased to note that just in the fiscal year 2022 appropriation bill, there's $480 million for the next chunk of this project, which is fantastic. And that's the amount that President Biden put into the administration budget for this project. So there's been tremendous support for this project from both the Biden administration and the Trump administration, quite frankly, before them. And Congress has stepped forward as well. And so the project, again, 4 years into construction right now, it's probably a 8 to 10 year construction timeline, and things are going well. We're gonna keep working to make sure the funds keep flowing to keep the project on schedule. Next slide, please. Big issue in the Great Lakes is ice breaking. For those of you who don't know or realize, the Great Lakes are not saltwater like the coast, they're freshwater, and freshwater freezes much more easily than saltwater, and it freezes harder. The Great Lakes region is pretty far north, and so the combination of freshwater and harsh winters leaves us with a navigation system that's covered with ice at times. And the Coast Guard is responsible for providing ice breaking services on the Great Lakes, and historically have maintained a fleet of icebreakers on the Great Lakes to keep the shipping lanes open and to keep commerce moving. Unfortunately, since the late 70s, the Coast Guard's fleet of icebreakers have atrophied. We're down to 9 icebreaking vessels from 14. The Coast Guard has unfortunately not been enthusiastic about committing budgetary resources to beefing up their icebreaking fleet on the Great Lakes. That fleet is necessary to keep commerce moving. We've had unfortunate circumstances in past years where commerce has stopped. Deliveries of critical raw materials to steel mills have stopped. Ships have been stuck in the ice. Ships have been sliced open by ice. Mariners have been put in danger by bad ice situations. All that needs to stop, and we need to fix this problem. I want to give a call out to the Lake Carriers Association, which is the American carriers on the Great Lakes, for leading an effort that our group is helping on, and Maritime Labor is helping on, and many others, to try to push forward through Congress new funding for a new heavy icebreaker on the Great Lakes, and then also for enactment of something called the Great Lakes Winter Commerce Act, which would be a law to establish performance metrics for the Coast Guard, so that as they break ice on the Great Lakes, they're actually doing so not based on their budgetary resources, but based on commercial metrics, what the needs of commerce are, not, hey, how much money do we have? And so we're working with Congress. I'm pleased to say that the Great Lakes Winter Shipping Act has been included in the National Defense Authorization Act, which is moving through Congress. And then funding for the new icebreaker, $350 million, has already been included in the budget reconciliation bill that's moving through Congress. I think you all know from watching the media that that bill is a $3.5 trillion bill, and it'll probably take a haircut before it's done. We're working now to try to make sure this project doesn't take a haircut and that it stays in the final package. Next slide, please. As Aimee pointed out a few minutes ago, a huge priority probably for any port in the United States is MARAD's Port Infrastructure Development Grant Program. We are big supporters of this program, and we work closely with our congressional delegation to urge them to add their voice to the voice of others from the inland river system and from coastal ports to try to encourage Congress to fund this program and put more resources into this program. I think one thing I've heard throughout the Propeller Club presentations today and yesterday was the need for more infrastructure investment at the nation's ports. And so this is the primary vehicle to accomplish that at the federal level. Fortunately, huge amounts of money have been added to both the bipartisan infrastructure bill that the Senate approved and is awaiting approval in the House, and also the budget reconciliation bill. So hopefully we're going to see large investments through this program in infrastructure at the nation's ports, and we commend Congress for those efforts. Next slide, please. One odd issue in the Great Lakes that we're working on that I'll mention quickly, but it's a threat, is a proliferation of marine sanctuaries. Some of you know that because you probably live near them or work near them, throughout the United States and US waters, there are marine sanctuaries that have been established by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. In most places in the United States, these are protecting sensitive environmental areas that are underwater, such as coral reefs. In the Great Lakes, we have marine sanctuaries that are protecting shipwrecks. They're primarily there to protect underwater cultural resources, such as shipwrecks. The problem is we've had a proliferation of these things. There are currently 2 established marine sanctuaries in the Great Lakes. There's a 3rd in the works right now that's just went out for public comment. There are 5 more in the pipeline. And what we're worried about is huge sections or geography of water getting locked up into restrictive regulations under these marine sanctuaries. We've tried to work closely, as have our carriers, with NOAA to make sure they were not imposing restrictions on navigation channels or ports or dredging or any activity that's required by the Coast Guard or Corps of Engineers. But the proliferation of these marine sanctuaries is a real concern in the Great Lakes. I find it ironic that there seems to be more excitement about preserving the ships that have sunk than the ships that are still afloat. Next slide, please. Last issue I'll talk to, and I'll let the others make their presentations, is resiliency. Like the coastal areas and like the inland river system, Aimee had mentioned the flooding on the river system. We have our own problems in the Great Lakes with regards to resiliency. The Great Lakes are historically high right now. The lakes don't have this notion of sea level. The lakes fluctuate, and it has to do with the inflow of water into the Great Lakes from the various rivers that feed into them. It has to do with ice cover during the winter and how much evaporation occurs during the winter based on that ice cover. But the lakes are very high right now. And you couple the high water levels with severe winter storms, and the combination have been deadly, and the combination has really ripped up the shorelines in a lot of Great Lakes cities. We had one port in upstate New York that was severely damaged in 2017 by the combination of a bad winter storm and high lake levels. Early 2020, the Port of Milwaukee, which lies on Lake Michigan. It wasn't on Lake Michigan, it was in Lake Michigan. Port was completely flooded because the lake was high and a storm had essentially come out of the east and pushed the entire lake to the west, which causes a flooding on the western shore of Lake Michigan. Consequently, there's a need for resiliency planning in the Great Lakes, as there is in many coastal areas. And the Corps of Engineers, thankfully, is launching a Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study this year, which will ultimately lead to scores of projects around the region to make our waterfronts and our ports more resilient to damage, to resist damage, and to be functional no matter what comes at them as far as weather events. With that, I'll wrap up my comments. Again, thank you to the Propeller Club. I look forward to questions after my fellow panelists have a chance to talk. And with that, I'll pass it off now to Mark Wright. Art.
Hey, good morning. I hope, excuse me one second. Good morning. Thanks, Aimee. And thanks, Propeller Club, for inviting me to be a part of this. AWO has always, valued our relationship with the Propeller Club, whether it be local or internationally. So we really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk. I'm going to hit on 3 areas that are most affecting our inland rivers members. Just so everybody's aware, AWO is comprised of approximately 300 member companies nationally, a huge portion of which operate on the Western Rivers or the Intercoastal Waterway. To give you an idea, we have over 30,000 mariners that work directly with our members. The inland system, the towboats and barges on the inland system push over 60% of the export grain market from the Mississippi River, and certainly over 600 million tons of cargo, whether it be dry cargo, liquid cargo, and such. So it's really an important part of our U.S. navigation system for our members. So this is something we spend a lot of time focusing on. My role with AWO, so it's clear, I live in Louisiana, work out of the Gulf Coast, the southern region, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and even Oklahoma, the Port of Catoosa. So get a really good opportunity to interact with our members, the Coast Guard, particularly, the 8th District is headquartered in New Orleans. We have some really important sectors, New Orleans and Houston and Mobile and Corpus that we interact with as the Coast Guard seeks to, encourage, let's just facilitate commerce as the mission is stated. Let me start with one. I'd like to talk about 3 areas that I think are important for you to understand today, give you a picture of where we are. Let's start with, the aftermath of Hurricane Ida. There's still a lot of ramifications about what happened there. Also, I'd like to talk about our work with the Coast Guard in maintaining waterways management on the Western rivers. They just produced a study that tells a lot about what's going on. And then finally, I'd say I'd like to talk about our work through the River Industry Executive Task Force, which is an AWO-led group that includes, Admiral Timmy, for example, in the 8th District, General Holland with the Mississippi Valley District, and then we have industry members who interact to help them maintain commerce on the rivers. So first, I think everybody has seen a lot of the headlines related to supply chain problems and things like that. And so it's been no different on the Mississippi River, honestly, but it's been compounded by what happened following Hurricane Ida, which was the last weekend of August. First off, Captain Will Watson, the captain of the port at Sector New Orleans, did an incredible job dealing with a very difficult situation. For those of you who may not have paid attention to some of the details, there was a huge transmission line over the Mississippi River that fell, essentially into the water, and it essentially cut off the Mississippi River from one half to the next, right around the Huey P. Long Bridge. And why that's important is it made it very difficult to get horsepower from one section to the next and to get commerce moving during that first week. Ultimately, by the end of that first week, Entergy, the utility, was able to cut it, but it was a difficult challenge because that transmission line basically helped power the entire city of New Orleans and its metro area. So it was not an easy discussion or engineering challenge for that matter. One of the things that came about from Hurricane Ida is basically put a lot of hopper barges out of use. I like to read and would recommend to you the River Transport News, and Sandor Toth does great work there. I mean, just in his recent newsletter, talked about how the estimate is that the industry lost use of about 1,000 hopper barges, and mostly because of the covers that are needed. And of course, when you combine that with there was a number of grain export facilities that went down. I think the big ones are not. There's 9 of them in the Mississippi River, lower Mississippi River, and I think they're up to 7 now. But there's 2 more that still need to come online at a super important time for export grain. I mean, it's the beginning of harvest. A month or so ago, this is when a lot of the work is done over the next month or 2, and it just has sort of slowed down things. And everybody is working to get it moving, and you see general progress, but at the end of the day, it really has sort of slowed things down. You combine that with some of the labor concerns. Inflation in a variety of ways affects the work, including mariners, right? It's increased wages and made it a challenge to maintain mariners to operate, at full capacity. So that's the type of thing that I hear from our members and the challenges they have. The good news is, I was talking to a smaller member last week who works in the liquid cargo market, and so was finally able to put some more vessels to work in the last week. So that shows the liquid cargo is starting to pick up. Of course, they got to find mariners to work it. That's been a bit of a challenge, but I think we're slowly seeing that. And of course, higher energy prices, whether it be natural gas, coal, anything liquid, any sort of petroleum based is, always going to, when you have the higher prices, it brings more people back to the market. And I think you'll see a slow, change in that direction, hopefully by the end of the year, at least on the Mississippi River system. Another area I'd love to share with you is AWO's work with the Coast Guard related to aids to navigation on the Western rivers. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Coast Guard headquarters, CGNav, published the WAM study that they had been working on for Western rivers now, probably 3 or 4 years, and that's the Waterways Analysis and Management System study. Essentially, what that does is looks at how the Coast Guard provides service to commercial navigation and actually recreational for that matter, but through its ATON cutters and other methods. AWO had worked with the 8th District going back now about 4 or 5 years to assess all of the aid system on the Western rivers, particularly the Mississippi River, but all of the tributaries, and help the Coast Guard identify ways to keep costs low, maintaining the cutters. It's a very aged fleet, and they have just recently started to recapitalize that fleet. It'll take a few years, but one of the things that results from an aged fleet is that the maintenance can really put a crimp in maintaining that service, especially in the fall times, because the Mississippi River runs low, so the drafts are kind of tight, and so that our members really rely on buoys on the Mississippi River. But one of the things that came about from the study, or at least was pronounced, was 2 things, and this is important for participants to understand as far as the inland system. Our captains, our mariners in the wheelhouse really rely on some physical buoys on the inland system. I mean, there have been voices in the past that have suggested it could go all digital, and AWO, its member companies, and our mariners in the wheelhouse have said absolutely not. Need some physical buoys on the river to be able to navigate safely. Now, what the Coast Guard has done is really started to augment those physical systems with digital systems and AIS. And so you've got probably the best of both worlds. So where the Coast Guard can't perhaps maintain some physical buoys on the river because of timing or maintaining the cutters, there still is a digital aspect to it that helps, keep that moving. But it was really important for us as an association to see the Coast Guard came out essentially in their level of service memo, which is an important statement that they will always seek to maintain physical buoys on the Mississippi River. One other aspect to it that was, when we did this assessment with the Coast Guard was we were able to show that some of their shoreside aids were probably not as important anymore to our wheelhouse personnel. And ironically, the Coast Guard spent a lot of resources maintaining those shoreside aids. These are things like mile boards along the Mississippi River. And so there now is an opportunity for them to save some costs in maintaining or really not maintaining every single shoreside aid that, I guess years ago, probably we relied on, a lot to a much greater extent. And the final area I'd love to talk about is our work with the Coast Guard and the Corps in facilitating commerce, particularly around this time of the year. AWO staffs a task force I just mentioned. We call it REDIF. It's River Industry Executive Task Force. That is co-chaired by an industry co-chair that works for an AWO or leads an AWO company, along with the 8th District, commander and the Mississippi Valley Corps commander. And what we do with that task force is essentially identify commercial navigation concerns, navigational safety concerns, to make sure that resources are put whether it be from an industry perspective or whether it be from a government agency perspective, that resources are put in place to make sure that that there's not delays in navigation and there's no safety concerns. And that can be everything from, core locks, that work that's being done. It could be dredging in certain parts that makes it difficult for, a 40 barge tow to come down the Mississippi River. There's a lot of aspects that go with it. But in the end, I think it's sort of an unsung story for our nation's export system that our members and the Coast Guard and the Corps work together in that way to make sure that, obviously safe navigation, but also continue to facilitate that commerce. And what we've found is, in the past, you see REDIF go to work, especially in the fall when so much is at stake coming down the Mississippi River from harvest and for the export grain market. One other thing I'll point out, it's an inland, obviously this is an inland panel, but something that I think everyone is starting to see, particularly with this new Biden administration. AWO has started to work with its members to focus on decarbonization issues. We have found our members, in working with their customers, working with the suppliers, needs to sort of be part of that discussion. As they say, if you're not at the table, you can occasionally be on the menu. And so what AWO has particularly done over the last year or two is start to engage our members and what would a decarbonization effort look like for the towing and barge industry. We participated in some other efforts, let's just say, a Shell-led effort in one case, and in others where we essentially trying to look at what would the next 10 years look like? What would a decarbonization look like for the towboat and barge industry? And our members are certainly embracing that. Part of the decarbonization and the environmental focus is offshore wind. And so just in the last, about 2 months ago, AWO, my office, the Southern Region office, submitted a letter to BOEM related to Gulf of Mexico offshore leasing and what would be important to our members for engaging that. And so I think, particularly in Louisiana, but certainly other parts of the Gulf, what you'll see is some sort of coastal or inland ports start to look at participating in that supply chain. That is a real opportunity for work, whether it be the offshore marine group of the industry or our members at AWO. There's going to be opportunities to create, supply, maintain that offshore energy system, particularly in the Gulf. And that's where we're starting to look. We've had, in the last couple of years, we've had other interactions, particularly on the Atlantic, where they've been a bit, further ahead than the Gulf, but you're also seeing on the Pacific, obviously, opportunities to, look at getting involved with wind energy that, is certainly going to be a part of our energy portfolio in the United States in the next generation. So, Aimee, with that, I will turn it over to our next panelist and look forward to question and answers as we move on. Thank you.
All right. I assume you all can hear me okay. My name is Bill Stahlman with American Central Port here in the St. Louis region. And I think what you all have probably been able to gain from both Mark and Steve is our industry, while we have quite a bit of challenges on the public policy side of things on any given year, and obviously the past couple of years, things have been a little bit wacky, not only in the U.S. but throughout the world as far as how things are moving up and down our various modes of transportation. But hopefully be able to give you guys a little bit of a insight on how the inland river system kind of ties into the rest of the transportation infrastructure that we've got in our country, and what some of those opportunities are bringing to some of the smaller ports in the area. I got some slides here. This thing started. If you go ahead and go to the next slide here. Most of y'all are pretty much familiar with the layout of the U.S. Those orange dots, you'd probably recognize those as some of the larger coastal ports that we've got here in the country. And as you kind of look into the Midwest, the heartland of the country, you kind of see 5 additional red dots locations: Chicago, Kansas City, St. Louis, Memphis, and New Orleans. I'll kind of touch in here a little bit. Kind of go next slide. So most of y'all are obviously familiar with ports. Some of the struggles as far as how they operate, what the kind of issues they've got, whether it's air draft, dredge depth, what kind of equipment are servicing the ships and the boats that are coming in, what kind of existing infrastructure gets tied into it, what kind of land availability is there to maximize the movement of the goods to and from the mode of transportation. And we start to kind of take all these aspects into consideration. There's really only a couple locations throughout the country that can really grow and be utilized to an efficient manner of moving cargo. Kind of go to the next slide. So previous Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood, who's kind of from our neck of the woods here in Illinois, had a great quote that I felt really summed up ports in general. It's ports, freight rail, and trucking are bound together logistically and economically, and we need to view them as holistically. And the gist of what he's getting at here is, you know, when we talk about ports, a lot of times we tend to focus on the waterbound cargo and how it's getting to the land. And while that's good and that's what we live day in, day out, obviously there are multiple modes that are getting tied into and how that cargo is moving from point A to point B and finally to its destination. And especially when it comes to public policy side of things, is we really need to be looking at this as a complete system. And how all these modes not only work together, but how are we moving cargo efficiently within the mode and between the modes. Next slide. So specifically kind of get into where I'm at, the St. Louis region. If you remember those red locations up and down the heartland, St. Louis is one of the larger metropolitan ports here on the inland river system. And we're located pretty much at the confluence of the Mississippi River with both the Missouri and the Illinois. Missouri running out to KC, and then the Illinois running all the way up into the Lake Michigan and access into the Great Lakes. So the Port of Metropolitan St. Louis is pretty much a grouping of multiple local ports, both on the Illinois side as well as the Missouri side, including the city of St. Louis. It's about a 70-mile stretch of river. Next slide. And when you're kind of looking at some of the larger inland ports, you know, it's a little bit different in how they aggregate the data and they rank them through the Corps listing, because some of these ports are larger in mileage versus the density. But as far as if you're looking at the ton miles, we move a lot of cargo, a lot of bulk goods through the St. Louis region, most of which is kind of grain material, fertilizer, plant food material going back to the farms, a lot of steel that's moving in. It's kind of the primary stuff that we're seeing here in the St. Louis market. Next slide. So kind of going back to the map here, the three main modes of how we're transporting goods. You know, we got 48,000 miles worth of major interstates that run throughout the U.S., 150,000 miles of rail track, 12,000 miles of coastal and inland waterways going on. Next slide. As you start to build out the map, you kind of see the interstate system here and where it starts to coalesce around some of the metropolitan areas, and not only on the coastal side, but those red dots here in the middle. Next slide. As you kind of get into the mode of rail, again, you know, we're getting cargo into the coast, into the Gulf, Great Lakes, and how is it that we're moving it to our Walmarts throughout the U.S.? Not only the interstate side, but when you start to look at the rail end of things, just the nature of how rail built out over time, you've got Class 1 railroads that operate primarily on the east side of the Mississippi and then the west side of the Mississippi. Mississippi kind of being where they all meet, the majority of which goes into Chicago, St. Louis and Memphis kind of being next in line, and New Orleans as well. And those locations are points of which the majority of the Class 1s come together. Again, opportunities of how you can provide different avenues for your shippers to get good pricing. Next slide. And you start to look at how the inland river system lays out. This is just the MARAD's map of their marine highway system. You kind of see, again, those red dots. We've got major navigable corridors running into them. That's tying into that rail infrastructure, that interstate infrastructure that gives a whole lot of opportunity and flexibility for the actual terminals that are bringing cargo to and from the river via belts, whether you're doing break bulk activities off of your dock. But as a shipper or some of our tenants and manufacturers that we've got here at these ports, again, it's opportunity and flexibility that they've got in how they're moving goods into the process and out of the process for export. Next slide. So some of you that are probably familiar with the coastal side of things, what this map is showing, let's say you've got something coming in from the Asian market. Those numbers in the circles are roughly the days that that ship gets from Asia to the coastal ports. And then those yellowish brown numbered circles, that's the amount of time via rail coming from that coastal area. And right now, this particular map shows into Chicago. As you see, it obviously takes time to get from the coast into Chicago. One thing a lot of folks don't realize is once you get to Chicago with the massive rail hub that it is, there are rail cars that literally take 3 days to get from one side of Chicago to the next, which kind of brings into focus some of the other locations along those corridors of the Mississippi River, whether that's St. Louis, Memphis, Kansas City, New Orleans, that those are natural relief valves to get these rail cars and the good and the containers off the coast and into the marketplace for distribution. Next slide. So St. Louis, being one of those locations, we're located within 2 days of 70% of the U.S. population, 60+% of the American businesses. So once your goods are not only coming to St. Louis or trying to get out, it's pretty good access, whether it's via truck or rail, to get to the water and out to the market via the coast, whether that's through the Great Lakes or down into the Gulf Coast. Next slide. So in Missouri, the western side of St. Louis, they've got 15 port authorities, and they're primarily located along the Mississippi River as well as the Missouri River, generally within the larger cities and municipalities along those waterfronts. Next slide. Illinois is similar. We've got 19 public port districts. Basically, each state kind of calls them a little bit different, but they all function primarily the same, most of which were modeled off of the old Newark, New Jersey legislative model. And we're all public entities and pretty much looking to provide access for a variety of different manufacturers and such to get to the water and utilize multiple modes of transportation. Next slide. So for those that aren't as familiar with how things run on the inland river system, I know when people tend to mention ports, the vision comes to mind of large cranes, massive amounts of piles of colored boxes, rail cars coming in. It's a little bit different when you come on the river system. So what you're looking at here on the picture is a lock. This is a typical lock that you would see on the inland river system. The one at the barge, that's a barge tow, that's going through what's called a main chamber. And typically what they do, these main chambers, you can do a 3x5 configuration. So each one of those little boxes is a barge. And then you got the tug at the bottom. There's a smaller chamber that's about half the size that they tend to break up the tows and move them in and out. But that's basically what the structure is in place on the navigable waterway that provides a pool that you can kind of climb up as the elevations change up and down. This particular lock is lock 27 here in St. Louis, and it is the last lock on the Mississippi River system. So everything south of St. Louis is all open water all the way down to the Gulf, whereas everything north, you're riding through a series of these locks to get your commodities up and down the river. Next slide. So like like anything else, the different types of things that you're moving, whether it's liquid or bulk, amongst the three different modes that I'd at least try to focus on here, river, rail, and road. That barge, that one little box, depending on the configuration, kind of like containers, you can move a variety of different types of commodities, whether it's liquid or dry or packaged goods in there. Dry bulk on the river, you're looking at about 1,700 and plus tons versus one rail car at 110 tons. You know, a semi-trailer, roughly 25 tons worth of good that's on there. Next slide. This picture, you probably may have seen different versions of it, but basically that one barge tow that you saw earlier going through that lock is equivalent to 2 unit train cars that have 110 cars on it, or over 1,000 trucks that are running on the roadway. So when you're talking bulk commodities, when you're talking large, heavy weighted things like steel coils, and even as we see moving forward here with containers on barge, you can take a lot of trucks off the road, rails off the rail lines, and just move things more efficiently off the river system. Not saying that we're eliminating the trucks or the rail, but just kind of give you a sense of scale of what we're doing here on the river system on moving goods. Next slide. So as you're starting to build things down river, those tows get larger. So this photo here is kind of a typical southbound tow, you know, running 20, 30 plus barges heading down. They typically start to max out as you get further down river. Just the river, as it gets closer to the Gulf, it's a little bit wider. You know, they're in the 40s, low 40s on what they're moving up and down the river. Next slide. You really won't see this again, but this just kind of like to throw this slide in here because this is the world record tow. You know, you're looking at 83 barges. One of those 83 is actually another tug that was going as a dead man up in a deadboat up and down the river. But that's about 6 football fields long, kind of give you a sense of scale. Granted, they don't move things of this magnitude today, but we do move a lot of goods with some pretty hefty boat power up and down the river. Next slide. So a little bit more localized as far as how a port operates. So the one that I'm at, America's Central Port, one of the 19 here in the state of Illinois. What you're seeing here is just kind of a map of our jurisdiction. We basically hug the river line on the east side of St. Louis, kind of north into the confluence of both the Missouri and the Illinois River. And we are a public entity. The state of Illinois created us. Most of the ports here in Illinois were back in '59. And we have 3 primary legislative mandated missions. One is to develop the intermodal transportation opportunities for business, you know, create that expansion opportunity for businesses through transportation utilization, and then facilitate and assist in job creation. So the whole goal is to provide opportunities to businesses as well as, you know, the locals here to kind of get into various different modes of transportation. Next slide. And we have pretty much the same legislative powers that you would see any city have, you know, as far as we can issue bonds, we can levy taxes, eminent domain, develop utilities, we can have a police force if we want to do that. Anything a city can do, we can do as well as a port. And most public ports have similar legislation as well. Next slide. But the difference is, and I kind of like to describe us more as a for-profit government. We don't levy any taxes. We don't have sales, property, motor fuel tax, hotel tax, utility fees. We actually have to earn our dollars. We do that through terminal fees, leases of the ground that we have control over, some of the assets and terminals that we have in place off the water system. And we are successful through competitive grants from time to time. And that's how we not only cover our operating costs, but how we reinvest into our facilities for our tenants and our operators. Next slide. So back in the 40s is kind of when Lock 27 was built. And traditionally the Mississippi River, as you got to just north of St. Louis, there was what's called the chain of rocks. And really that river was only reliable a couple months out of the year. Otherwise you're tearing the hulls out of boats because there's a natural rock outcropping underwater there. So the Corps of Engineers back in the 40s dug a 9-mile canal, big old ditch here to bypass that rock structure and create the actual navigable part of the Mississippi north of St. Louis. And at that time, they also kind of made a little marginal harbor cut out just north of the lock there. And that's what was pretty much the start of our particular port here in the Illinois side of St. Louis. And next slide. And over time, really kind of started more in the mid 60s is when things started building out. We started with the general cargo dock, added some fertilizer and grain facilities over time. And we'll cycle through some of these next slides pretty quick here, just to kind of give you an idea of some of the facilities that we have. So this is our Granite City Harbor. We've got a roll-on, roll-off facility, being able to move bulk goods. The Army utilizes that often to maneuver some of their equipment up and down the river system. Next slide. We've got a fleeting service. So those similar kind of what you see on the coast when you got tugboats coming in to grab those big ships. Same thing up and down the river system. You got those line haul boats, those larger boats moving the big tows into an area, into a fleeting service. And we've got smaller local boats that grab those barges in and out of the fleets to take them to terminals and back. So we have a large fleeting service here, switching service based out of our harbor. Next slide. And we got several different terminals, one being liquid bulk. This is pretty much 100% asphalt coming not only inbound off the river system, but we move it on rail and truck. We've got some large refineries just north of us here in Wood River, Illinois. They utilize a lot of this petroleum product coming in. Next slide. We've got a variety of different belts to the river. This one kind of being a dry bulk. We move a lot of grain through this facility. We've done some aggregate in the past, fertilizer through this facility. Next slide. Got another one, same thing. We've got the farmers bringing in their grain locally via truck, as well as some of the rail cars coming in, and this is running out to the river, filling up barges, heading down south for export. Next slide here. Fertilizer, same thing. Those farmers like to do a back haul, so we've got dry bulk fertilizer coming in that they can take a back haul back to the farm. And then there's a little distribution facility here as well that you can come pick it up. They also add some water. They can do some spray on fertilizer and such as well. Next slide. And then we've got our general cargo dock up there at the Granite Harbor, where a lot of the steel that's being produced here at the mill would go export out. We've done some large equipment moves for some of the larger construction projects in the region. They move some of those big pieces of equipment on the river, kind of keep the congestion off the roadways. And we've done some container moves up here at the Granite Harbor as well. Next slide. So that was primarily what our port was up until about the late 90s. In 2001 timeframe, we actually bought an Army base just south of our facility there. A lot of that, this Army base that was south of us, it was built back in the World War II timeframe. Fortunately, never got used for its intention because the war was able to end prior to that. But there's a big old logistics depot, lots of warehouse space, infrastructure out there. But the Army never really utilized it. So over time, they kept trying to find ways to keep it active. And they tried to bracket out a couple times just because it wasn't really necessary for their mission anymore. But next slide. There's a program in place with MARAD called the Port Conveyance Program, to where traditionally a former base, if they want to get rid of it, DOD will give it to the GSA and they auction it off, which doesn't really work out well for a local community a lot of times because the lowest bidder, or I'm sorry, the highest bidder would come in, and usually you kind of get the lowest outcome of events. We've had some stories up here in Illinois with another former base north of us on the river that same sort of process, went out general auction, and somebody that bought it was probably 3 million square foot worth of warehouse space just came in and grabbed the copper and obviously made their investment back off off of copper, but now you've got warehouses that have no power and a little bit difficult to fill up with tenants now that a port took that over. So this program, the whole intention is that, you know, the DoD gives it to DOT, and through MARAD, we'll give it to a public port. And, you know, again, you buy an Army base for $1, sounds great until you realize you bought this Army base that, you know, the Department of Defense didn't really want to keep operational too much, so they moved off a lot of their maintenance dollars elsewhere. So when we got that, next slide, we've basically had to do a lot of investment, which, you know, this is through competitive grants. A lot of our general revenues have been going to rebuilding the streets, create that base infrastructure, roadway infrastructure, bring in heavy hauls that have access not only to our rail facilities, but as well as our waterfront facilities. Next slide. Same thing with rail. We've had to do a lot of investment in the rail. Back when this Army base was built, there was no such thing as a 100-car unit train. So things were a little tighter curves, smaller tracks. So we've had to build out something that can accommodate multiple large train sets coming in, so we can move, you know, the cars in and out and to our facilities a lot quicker. So we've done a lot of investment there. Next slide. Same thing with warehouses. If you can imagine a World War II era warehouse, there was no such thing as a 53-foot trailer, let alone, you know, slapping a sleeper cab tractor on there. Everything back then was really just a canvas covered truck. So we've had to do some configurations around those warehouses, cutting some docks back, moving some roadways so we can accommodate the trucks that are running on the road today. Same thing, adding some different lighting to be able to handle some of the manufacturing that's being done in these warehouses, different HVAC type things, so, you know, comfort levels for the employees out there. But, you know, these warehouses are located great in regards to the various different interstates that are nearby here in St. Louis, as well as the rail that's here. Next slide. Of which we also have a Class 3 short line that we brought in several years ago, and that's really to provide other flexibility in pricing and access for our tenants and operators that are here at the port. They offer 24/7 switching to move cars around, basically making sure that the access to rail cars is not a bottleneck in the operations that they've got going on, which anybody that's located on a Class 1 direct connection kind of probably appreciates the need of, you know, getting a switch call late at night to move some cars around. Next slide here. But the better part with this former base is the fact that there was a lot of open ground. Again, this was a logistics depot for the Army back in the day, so it was a lot of laydown area, a lot of open ground that was available, that we've been able to take advantage of several different opportunities to just kind of grow business here in the region. So if you're looking at that photo, the Chain of Rocks Canal up there in the upper left, that's where our basically the original harbor is, with all those facilities that you saw. And then as you come down on the bottom side of the page, you kind of see a kind of an open spot in the trees. That's the former wharf that was part of the Army base. And, you know, the Army had different things. They moved up and down the river, and they just pretty much parked the boat up against the shore and dropped some ramps and moved things on and off, which is kind of what we've taken advantage of as far as an opportunity when we took over that Army base to develop a new harbor. Next slide. Let's see, we do have some private owners down on the Army base. We've got a lumber company that manufactures wood trusses, so they rail a lot of wood in. They brought some wood in off the river system in the past. We've got a big industrial bolt company that pretty much the majority of the bridges you see being built in the U.S., money would be best put down that those bolts were coming out of this facility here. Next slide. Then this particular development, like I mentioned, we had a lot of open ground. We were able to tracked basically an ethanol company back in the 2009 timeframe when ethanol was a pretty big boom here in the Midwest. But this particular development was kind of the catalyst for us to embark on a brand new harbor south of Locks 27 on the Mississippi River system. And they pretty much operate 24/7, bringing in grain, bringing in a bunch of different things where they're pushing out obviously the ethanol, the DDGs that are going to the harbor. Next slide. We've got some other manufacturers that utilize multiple modes of transportation out here. One of them being Horizon companies that make these air-supported domes that you see, probably a lot of indoor golf ranges, soccer complexes. You'll see them throughout cities. They get manufactured here. Next slide. But this is kind of where we've placed a lot of our investment here in the past few years. We created another harbor. Again, you can kind of see Locks 27 there in the background with our old former harbor that's still in operation. But what this does is gives us a footprint south of the locks. Again, it doesn't really cost money to go through it, but it does cost time to kind of move through that particular lock. So this gives us a pretty much like the northernmost ice-free location on the Mississippi River that's south of the locks, which kind of opens up a lot of flexibility for our tenants and our operators. We built a new belt to the river that has rail capacity for multiple unit trains coming in, handles mostly ag products going outbound as well as some fertilizers. It does have the capability for liquid to be loaded out on barges as well. There is future plans for putting a liquid loadout here in the remaining open ground. But we also invested in a new general cargo dock in this location as well, which is really kind of been taken off, especially with this the container on barge move that's going on the river system. Granted, I think recently a lot of folks are seeing the pinch on just trying to find some boxes, but we have been making investments on this particular dock where our operators bought some new hydraulic cranes with various different container attachments. We actually just had a container tilter delivered today that'll be deployed out there to where we can, backhaul some ag products into a box and send it south, which our operators working on a regular service down to the Gulf out of this facility for container on barge. Next slide. We got a couple other things that are in the move here. We built a new warehouse facility recently that does kind of a specialty chemical processing, and they do a lot of importing of the oils via rail cars, and then they repackage into 4x4 totes and 55-gallon barrels that they load into shipping containers and send it out to the Gulf for export. We've got a bunch of different warehouses here that are ready to be constructed next year. Next slide. We've been making some significant investments in our dock. This particular one is that former dock up in Granite City, that harbor. We built some new fendering systems up along the sheet pile walls to extend the life. One thing that you kind of notice as a difference on the inland river system versus some of the icy environments in the Great Lakes, but more specifically on the coast with some of the corrosion issues in seawater, is the structures tend to last a little bit longer on the inland river system, the freshwater. While we don't have tidal changes, we do see some swings on the river system that can go 30, 40 foot within the course of a month. But this particular dock, again, that was built back in the 60s, and aside from some rust areas and some knuckles that were damaged over the years, that dock still has its design capacity at it. So we've got quite a bit of years left in this thing, especially with some of the investments we've been making with the fendering system. We've repaved that whole dock with concrete, rebuilt the rail access into that, and the operator that's working off that dock has replaced all of those stick cranes that you see in the photo with some hydraulic. I believe they got some Centebogen ones out there now that has some quick change attachments for dry bulk, for those C hooks for the containers, as well as some attachments for the containers. Next slide. One of the things that we've been noticing is the need for transload. So we've been building out some rail throughout the facility here that can get truck access to the rail lines. We've been doing transload with liquid commodities. We've been doing it with dry bulk. A lot of lumber has been coming in via rail that we've been able to move between different modes. Next slide. This is just a photo. This is kind of what that dock looks like now that saw earlier, some of the investments. So again, this is a heavily reinforced concrete cross section that we built out on that dock. New rail line. That's that hydraulic crane that we brought in that has really added to the efficiency of this dock and has made our operator a whole lot more nimble to react to how the market changes so quickly here on the river system. Next slide. One thing that ports tend to be good at is when they do have some of these older assets that they've acquired, we've been able to be quite unique in how we repurpose them. So this is just an example that we've done recently. This is the former steam plant that was on the Army base. So every one of the former buildings were heated by steam, and this is where that steam was produced. We recently gutted that, rehab the whole inside, and it is now it's actually a manufacturing company that makes some high-end optical mirrors for NASA. So there's a clean room in there, and they've got some interesting, unique manufacturing that goes on there. So the stuff that will get manufactured out of this former steam plant will now be transferred to rail for movement, but also they've got the opportunity that they'll be utilizing some deck barges for some of the larger stuff that they're going to be moving. Next slide. Again, more roadways that we're building, getting ready to do a large project here in the springtime that'll kind of reorient how the truck traffic is coming off the main highway that accesses the interstates into our facility. That'll kind of move the traffic through our warehousing district a little bit more efficiently. Again, you know, these being those World War II era warehousing and infrastructure layouts, projects like these that we've been successful with competitive grants will actually be able to increase the capacity and access for our tenants and manufacturers that are on site. So ports tend to do well when there is investment that's made, even if it's on a smaller scale like what we've got here through the state grant. Next slide. Just a little plan. Just again, ports. We tend to focus on how we bring and attract tenants. You know, the warehouses. We've been successful at building some spec shells and getting those filled up really quick. I mean, we've got about 2.5 million square foot of warehouse right now without a single square foot that's available. So once we've got it built, it gets filled up real quick. Again, you know, these manufacturers and warehousing distribution centers want access to multiple modes, and the fact that they've got access down to the Gulf via the waterway is definitely something they probably have never thought of in the past, but have been able to take advantage of here going forward. Next slide. So us being a smaller port, this is just kind of a slide that shows what kind of economic impact an operation like this has. So we bring in close to $300 million on an annual basis to our local economy. We've got just under 1,500 jobs that are associated with this 1,200 acres that we've got out here. But the bigger number that I like to kind of focus on is down there in the lower right. Is, you know, each year we've got over $1 billion worth of goods that are moving through our docks across our belts to the river and the rail lines. So this type of model, whether it's at our port, another port in Illinois, or anywhere else in the Midwest, you know, they are very successful at taking advantage of some of these opportunities to move goods across the various different modes. And I guess I kind of like to attribute that a lot of us working in the inland river system, we tend to have that farm boy mentality that, you know, as hard as things may be, especially with some of the public policy issues that we do tend to deal with to try to change and improve. At the end of the day, we find a way to get things done, keep things moving, and you know, we do very well as an industry with being resilient, being able to react to high water, low water, and keep that consistency for our shippers to be able to have some reliability within the system. But you know, at the end of the day, we do try to get things improved through these public policy options, like what Aimee was working on with trying to change how some of the funding gets doled out. Because you know, you get up into DC, you know, we may know our industry, whether it's the inland waterways or whether it's the coastal side of things. I think the majority of us here in attendance, we understand what we do day in, day out. We understand what the struggles are. We understand what the opportunities are. But you know, the general mom and dad that are running to the grocery store or to Walmart to pick something off the aisle, they don't quite think about the process of getting that grain out of the field onto some mode of transportation to get to the mill, to get to the place that'll make the bread, that then packages it, distributes it to the grocery store so they can pick it up and take it to the house and make their sandwich. But everything's connected. Everything it needs to be kind of considered with that. And I think our industry, while we understand it, there's definitely an improvement that needs to be made on how we tell our story. So like I say, when we're in DC, just even talking to the folks that are trying to create these programs that we can access, that dole out some of these funding opportunities, it's trying to find that good narrative that gets the point across of why ports, why the waterways, why the railways, why the roadways are important. Generally speaking, people know and want to see investment in the infrastructure, but trying to make that tie into why we need to continue to make this investment, and you know, why we need to make sure that there's maintenance opportunities available for funding. Because you know, while the general politician might like to see the ribbon cutting for the new construction period project that's going on, there's definitely infrastructure out there that needs attention. But even with all the attention that this infrastructure we have needs, we still are the envy of the world of what we have available, which just means that the opportunities are abound as far as what we could tap into if we continue to drive that narrative home and increase the opportunities for us to invest. But I guess with that, I'll hand it back to Aimee. We can kind of get this panel started and see if you all have any questions.
Thank you so much, Bill. I think my panelists are going to turn their videos back on and unmute themselves. As they do, I just wanted to say to the audience, I think after hearing from all of our panelists today, you can see that there are more ports than simply on the east and west coast. There are many ports that serve the river system and the Great Lakes system. To find any of those ports, I do want to direct you to the IRPT website. We have mapped out those ports, so it's easy to find a service provider in and around the area of your, you know, whether you're shipping to, or maybe you're wanting to find an alternative supply chain solution. So IRPT.net, and you can view terminals and try to find a service provider. You were treated to an in-depth view from Bill, you know, on what a port does, and depending on the river and the lake system is crucial for ports to operate, to be in business. When I say ports, I'm still talking about river, road, and rail, because they all offer the river, road, and rail. So what Steve does at the American Great Lakes Ports Association and what Mark does at the AWO is absolutely crucial for our ports and our terminals and the IRPT members. So I do want to open this up for questions, maybe from the audience. I do have a question, just kind of what about dredging? I do think that perhaps dredging on the lake system, the Great Lakes, might be a little bit different than what you typically see on the Mississippi River as far as dredging the lower Miss. I know that there's an initiative right now to deepen the Mississippi River in the mouth of the river. There's dredging needs along what IOPT considers the lower Mississippi River, which would be really St. Louis south. And that's an annual kind of operation and maintenance type of dredging from the Army Corps of Engineers. I know that Stas and I were kind of looking at alternative solutions to that annual maintenance that's needed at some of the harbors. But Steve and Mark, is there anything that you want to talk about as far as dredging and what our current needs are?
If you want to go ahead.
I could just comment, I'd mentioned this in my slides, that we have about a $375 million backlog of dredging in the Great Lakes. And we think the solution to that is to really just increase overall federal investment in the Corps' operation and maintenance budget. The good thing about that is, that's a common goal of everybody on the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund funding system. So we can work hand in hand with coastal ports and others who are funded that way to try to increase investment from Congress in the Corps, and it'll trickle down to us, and eventually we'll whittle back that backlog of dredging. But that's our approach, and we think it's a successful approach, and it's proven successful thus far. We've whittled back the backlog to some degree. There's a long way to go, but last year's water resource bill laid out special provisions, special budgetary treatment for the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund that ought to result in more spending from the trust fund for the Corps. And we think that'll eventually trickle down to the Great Lakes, and we'll get our fair share of it, and we'll end up having our harbors addressed. I'm sure this is true of all the coastal ports as well. But let me ask my colleagues, because I know the Inland River system is funded differently, and so I don't mean to speak for that. It's a more complicated system.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a few things to discuss about dredging in the inland system as far as our members are concerned. I mean, Aimee, you made mention that there was funding. It was really helpful from a Louisiana perspective. We supplied some funds to increase the depth of the lower Mississippi, at the mouth going up into New Orleans. That's a big deal. It's up to, we're trying to get it up to 50-foot draft. I know the ports, particularly Port of New Orleans, Port of South Louisiana, Port of Baton Rouge, that was a very important step. I know Congressman Graves out of Baton Rouge, he's on, T&I committee, and he has worked in coastal protection and restoration. So he's got a lot of expertise in that, has worked on a number of initiatives. One of them is a pilot program to sort of look at some alternatives to how we dredge in the U.S., how the Corps works with states, particularly Louisiana and others. Our members also obviously rely on dredging for shallow draft areas along the Mississippi River, and that's a super important aspect for us. I mentioned REDIF earlier. That's one of the things that tends to come up in the fall. Because it's low water, because of shoaling, you ended up having spots where you can't get barges through, let's just say safely or cleanly. They rely on, safe 9 to 12 feet of draft, and particularly when you're bringing down the type of barge cargo that, you see in the fall, just there's no room for error, right? So there is a lot of work with the Corps on that, but of course, there's only so many dredges in the U.S. There's reasons for that, which we don't have to visit today. But that's one of the reasons why Congressman Graves has been looking at some alternatives to try to, change that up. Because what ends up happening is, at times, and this is not a criticism in any kind of way, but at times you see some competition between the inland, shallow draft area needs for dredging versus the deeper draft, and the Corps works with us. We really appreciate that.
But at the end of the day, you can't get it exactly, and occasionally you'll hear people on conference calls or meetings just kind of say, the U.S. is arguably the greatest economic power in the world these days, and we can't get certain parts of the river dredged. That says a lot, honestly. But I think it says a lot about the fact that I think all three of us have a theme. All three of us have discussed, which is that, if the everyday citizen, the everyday member of Congress, the federal government, if you don't see what goes on in the Mississippi River Valley, on the Great Lakes, you really don't understand the importance. You don't understand the commodity supply chain importance. And so when you're fighting over resources in DC, it's just easy for it to go to other places. And, I think we need to recognize that at times. I know, I'm sure all of us here on this call have, spent time in DC, on Capitol Hill, trying to tell our story and things like that. And my hope is, all these infrastructure efforts, all this money that's going to infrastructure or supposed to go to infrastructure this fall in Congress, we'll see some alleviation of that and really dedicate it to our inland system.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that. As I mentioned before, Bill is also the chair of the Illinois Ports Association, and he has been associated with that since the beginning of its formation. And because of the work that the Illinois Ports Association has done, the state of Illinois has started their capitalization program. Bill, the question is, can you describe the port's success in securing state appropriations and state funding for your ports?
Yeah, I guess twofold, but it all ties back to you got to be able to tell your story. Whether it is you as the individual port that's going after state funds, federal funds, you're basically needing to explain not only your need, but why the investment is going to make an impact on the overall region of the state, to an individual that's reviewing these things that really doesn't understand our industry and may know it exists, but doesn't understand some of the details and intricacies of how it operates. So the state of Illinois, when they created most of these ports here, so again, 19 of them, some of them were lucky to where they got a stipend to start off with. For example, our port, when we were created in '59, there were 2 staff members, a retired colonel out of the Corps, and then he had a secretary to kind of help out with some admin work. And the state gave a $13,000 stipend to last 2 years and basically said, you're on your own, figure out a revenue stream. But you better start figuring out ways to bring jobs to the region, increase transportation access. Ports have to kind of get creative of how they make that happen. The state of Illinois has never had a funding stream dedicated to the maritime industry in its past. I know a couple of previous directors here at the port worked together to get legislation in place almost a decade and a half ago called a revolving loan fund. Basically be able to access some small grants to work on small loans to work on projects up to like $1 million. They never funded it. The legislation is there, the framework's there, it's ready, it's passed, but they've never put money in it. So several of us kind of got together a few years ago and said, hey, we're all have the same struggles. We'd like to see more attention in Springfield, not only legislatively, but even within IDOT of, hey, let's roads are great. We need to invest in those, but there's other modes, some very robust transportation opportunities here in the state, whether that's rail or whether that's marine. But we'd like to have the maritime industry at the table for funding. So, we started to develop that narrative, that story to kind of impact not only our legislators, but even those staffers there at IDOT to understand that, hey, this is something to pay attention to and invest in. And we were successful. We had asked to try to include $35 million into the next capital bill a couple of years ago, dedicated to the waterways, but they actually ended up putting 150 in there, to our surprise, which is great. 40 of which kind of got peeled off for a project south there at the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi, but that left 110 for a grant program for the rest of the ports to kind of go in for. That grant program opened up this past spring, early summer timeframe. And we should start seeing announcements on those projects here yet this fall. So not much time left in fall, but should be hearing that shortly. And what that is it's an opportunity for up to even 100% funding for projects that these ports have. And I know when we polled the members of what kind of projects they've got on just the drawing board of ideas, we had over $350 million worth of projects that were just needing money, needing investment towards it. So it was a great story that we're able to kind of get IDOT some funds available to distribute through the legislator. But at the same time, IDOT also realized through these discussions that we do have an excellent asset here in Illinois that has not had a whole lot of attention put towards it. And IDOT embarked on what was originally going to be just a small study to identify the 19 ports and as far as contacts, what kind of assets and facilities they might have there to help with some marketing for these ports, which that really snowballed into a much larger planning study that looked at the economic impact of all these ports within the state. It looked at some of the dredging review and kind of compared some of the dredging issues that we see here in Illinois as far as some of the regulative red tape compared to our sister neighboring states, as well as some of the provinces up in Canada. They looked at pretty much every aspect you can think of that we deal with on a daily basis as an Illinois port, and got some excellent information out there that not only is going to kind of help us with developing that narrative and story when we go for some competitive federal grants, but more importantly, it informs our legislators here locally on the state side that, hey, even if you don't have a port in your district, you have a manufacturer, you have a business that relies on access to the waterways, which is pretty much a good news story, I think, going forward.
Thank you, Bill. And I know that we are running out of time. So Stas, when you're ready to cut us off, please let me know. I do hope we can get this one last question in, which is container on barge has been in place for decades in Europe. The US continues to lag in this. So do you think the delay of this in the US is infrastructure lacking, or shippers considering this as an option? Or is there another hurdle that we might encounter regarding container on barge? I'm gonna just speak on this very quickly, and then I'm gonna go to Mark and then Bill and Steve to see if you have any further comments. I will say container on barge in the United States, there's really two types of container on barge. There's a domestic move and there's an international move. What we've seen is very successful in the US, and perhaps compared to the European model, is the domestic move. Maybe it's a lot of cargo coming out of Chicago into the St. Louis area, or St. Louis into Baton Rouge, or maybe it's Memphis to Kansas City. When you have to consider an international component of that container move, so it's coming out of Asia into the United States into a port of entry, it's then being transloaded onto a barge, or it's sitting in port storage waiting for the rest of the container friends to fill up the barge. That's when you have more of an issue. But when you have a shipper-driven container project, and what I mean by shipper-driven, maybe it's their own manufacturer, and they want to ship these containers to their own distribution center. That's what works. That's a domestic move where it is a shipper-driven move, and they're filling the container with their own product, shipping it from manufacturer to storage site or beyond. So with that, Mark, do you have anything else to add regarding container on barge and what may or may not let that work here in the United States?
Yeah, sure. Let me start by saying this is Mark Wright's point of view, so not necessarily AWO's, and not that it conflicts. It's just not something we have particularly, our membership has developed a message about, but sometimes I think it's a little unfair to compare it to the European situation. And I think it's partly because of what you just said, Aimee, but if you saw that slide that Bill had in his presentation about the times it takes to get to the West Coast, to the East Coast, and then to come into the Gulf through the Panama Canal,
The bottom line is our population base, our density is on the coast, right? And so when they're shipping containers, right, New Orleans does not have a lot of container ports. The Port of New Orleans is working really hard to expand that in the coming years. It's going to be a great step for us, but you don't see a lot of containers comparatively speaking to like a Houston or certainly a Savannah, Jacksonville, that type of thing. And so what I think ends up happening is you just don't have that critical mass to bring into, the mouth of the Mississippi River to go up or down. I mean, we have some members that I'm aware of who have taken into that container on barge, that sort of subsidized program. I think I had a conversation with a couple of CEOs a few years ago for some of our bigger companies. And I think one of the things that kind of give you their perspective is that, they're focused on a lot broader market, right? To maintain their company's profitability and things like that, expand market share. And there's just not enough numbers there for them to look at changing the way they do things. I think it's changing a little bit, honestly, in the last couple of years. You're seeing some of these pilot programs, and we may see a huge uptake in the next decade or so. But I think right now it's just the numbers aren't there. Aimee, you touched upon it a little bit, the difference in that, and it'll be a while. And look, it's about resources, right? So at the end of the day, as we talked about with dredging, some of those services rely on the federal government providing some type of resource subsidization, and you can only get so much of that in this day and age. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate that. Bill, is there anything you'd want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess just real quickly, the comparison of opportunities we have here in the U.S. versus what's going on today in Europe. I love it when the international students come in here at the port and they're like, this weekend I want to go see the Niagara Falls. I want to see the Statue of Liberty. I want to go see the Sears Tower. I want to go down to the Grand Canyon. I also want to go see the sequoias out there in California. And it's like, you are not going to get that done in a weekend. So like I think the sense of scale of the landmass here in the U.S. What they've got going on in the European market, I mean, it's apples and oranges. However, we got the infrastructure to make it work. I mean, you could throw 70 plus boxes into one barge and move it up and down the river system, no problem. You can do that today. But again, it's aligning what the market's willing to do. And with a lot of that market here in the U.S. kind of building out with this just-in-time inventory, it's really kind of just changing that mindset that, you don't necessarily need to have something moving within 2 days to get to your inventory. There are other opportunities like the river system to get them on containers and work it through your logistics with that longer lead time to move on the water system. So it's there. Again, it's just getting that story out there, getting the shippers, the distribution centers to understand that they've got another option to save costs as long as they figure out how to work that into their schedule going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. Steve, is there anything that you want to add?
Yeah, just real quick. I know we're running out of time. We see this issue as sort of under the umbrella of short sea shipping, and the idea of moving freight in containers around regionally, short distances, not overseas, within the United States. We see that as short sea shipping. And there's challenges in the United States. In Europe, they have not only a very positive attitude towards short sea shipping under the EU umbrella, but it's not just investing in their waterways, it's actually imposing taxes on cargo shippers who want to move freight by road. It's actually a conscious effort to create an economic incentive to move freight off of roads and onto the waterways. That's why they're doing it. I think our country's nowhere near that point where we're actually going to penalize people who want to use trucking and highways in favor of trying to chase them onto the waterways. We're nowhere near that. However, there's a good reason to pursue conditions that enhance short sea shipping. That's both investing in our waterways, investing in our ports. Jim Patty and I have worked over a number of years ago to try to do away with the harbor maintenance tax on coastal short sea shipping movements, all to create a positive environment to do more of this. And I agree with you, Aimee, that it'll probably happen first and foremost within a single company moving goods from one of their operations to another one of their operations.
Thank you so much. I do believe that ends our session. We are out of time. We did go a little bit over, but thank you so much to our expert panelists. I totally appreciate your time and your willingness to participate and share.
Well, Niels Alland here, International President. What a great 3-day conference we've had. Fantastic. Here at the headquarters, Cheryl, Jim Patty, Joel Whitehead and I have been receiving phone calls, texts, emails with compliments. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Conference Planning Committee, Liz Miller, Korai Arakan, Jim Patty, Joel Whitehead, Philippe Degas, Maria Knatzer, Stas Baragunas, John Hart, Danae Bezintaku, Marianne Richards, James Patty, and Cheryl Rothbard. They worked for many months on this, then went to every 2 weeks meetings and then weekly with breakout sessions and talks with the panel moderators and the panelists. Thank y'all for doing that. I would ask you to stand and we would clap, but we're virtual. So you just have to imagine yourself standing and hearing the applause for this great conference. Thank you very much. I'd also like to personally thank all the moderators, the panelists. It's quite evident over the last few days. This is the 3rd day that the panel moderators were well prepared. The panelists had great presentations, and then thanks to our participants who asked some excellent questions and had some great dialogue. In fact, each and every one of our programs went to the full length of time, and then there was one that went a little bit over, but it was all very productive discussion. So thank you very much. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the different ports that helped sponsor this leadership conference. We had 12 ports that stepped up. This is something new for us, that they did sponsorships to help cover these costs and help the international budget. So I'd like to credit the Port of Charleston, the Port of Evansville, Port of Jacksonville, the Port of Mobile, Port of Nashville, Port of Patuca, Port of Piraeus, Port of Port Canaveral, Port of Manatee, Port of Tacoma, Port of Tampa, and Port of Washington, D.C. All of y'all stepped up. And New Orleans, somebody's motioning to me, so there was 13 ports. Thank you. That's the beauty of having the staff up here. But 13 ports all gave $500, and we recognize that that was over and above the dues that they sent up. These are difficult times during the pandemic, so thank you very much. I'd like to remind the port presidents that at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will reconvene the port's presidents meeting, and we have some important elections and some things to share. So I'd like to thank all of you and wish you a great day. And with that, we close out the leadership conference. Thank you.